Welcome back to welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse. Ryan Mountcastle returned from the injured list last night for the Orioles and had a really critical solo home run in the first inning, which at the time put the Orioles up 3-0. It was so critical because the Orioles ended up winning the game only 3-2. So his home run and his run scored turned into being the decisive run in the Orioles' victory last night against the Oakland Athletics. With the return of my Ryan Mountcastle to the Major League roster, however, it does pose a lot of challenges for this Orioles team, for Tony Mansolino to try to navigate. In particular, for next year, I'm going to take some time to think through the implications for next year, just because that is a little bit what's more important when we're thinking about the Orioles, because as we all know, this season is rather lost. But there are going to be some logistical questions as well, just for the remainder of this year, what the Orioles are going to do, how they are going to try to best navigate roster with the diminished roster flexibility because Kobe Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle both occupy first base. So just trying to figure out, talk through what some of the options are for the Orioles for this year and going forward, what that means. So as I sort of referenced, Kobe Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle occupy first base. They can also, of course, both DH, which both of them playing first base is similar to the situation the Orioles had coming into the season when the Orioles had both Ryan O'Hearn and Ryan Mountcastle playing first base. Now, it was a little more preferable to have both of them at the first base position rather than the current setup with Mayo and Mountcastle, because at least with O'Hearn and Mountcastle, the Orioles had the option to platoon. And if it was a lefty on the mound that day, they could put Mountcastle out there. And if it was a righty, Ryan O'Hearn could go out there instead. Because it's now Mayo and Mountcastle with O'Hearn already having been dealt, that the Orioles now have two right-handed hitting first basemen who, as of now, can't really do much else. Now, Ryan Mountcastle really can't play anywhere else in the field. Kobe Mayo, he does have the ability to play third base. That also for the Orioles is a somewhat of a locked up position, at least when Jordan Westberg is not on the injured list as well. So Kobe Mayo, Ryan Mountcastle, as of right now, are being slotted in and sort of fixated on the first base position. Neither of them, other than being put into the DH slot, is going to be put into another position probably at any point in the season, I don't imagine. So it does sort of what are the Orioles supposed to do given this current configuration? How do you know when to put Mountcastle in there, when to put Mayo in there, and just how do we sort of navigate that situation? The Orioles at this current moment are sort of fortunate because they really only have one, maybe two other guys on this team that would DH. Adley Rutschman, of course, is an eligible DH candidate on any given night where the Orioles are not trying to put him behind the plate. With the Orioles sort of being where they're at now, though, if they want to give him a day off, then they don't really are probably won't feel the same pressure to get him into the lineup, just given that we're not trying to win games in the way that we would want to be winning games. If the Orioles were really committed to winning games in that sort of way, Rutschman would be more competition for that DH spot, but he still will make his way there on occasion. He is going to start at DH at least a few more times before the end of the season. So Adley Rutschman is sort of the one impediment in a potential scenario. If you have two really good first basemen, which Mayo and Mountcastle are don't really fit that category. But if you had two really, really great hitting first basemen and you wanted to get both of them in the lineup every single day, you could clearly have one DH and one be slotted into first base. Um, but neither Mayo or Mountcastle really fits that mold. It's a little unclear what the future value, how how good is Kobe Mayo going to be? Is he going to be as good as Ryan Mountcastle or better? Those are all sort of questions. So Adley Rutschman right now is sort of a potential competition for both Mountcastle and Mayo to get into the DH spot when one of them is not being put into the lineup at first base. The other potential competition, who he's played there a little bit so far this year, although I'm saying he's playing the DH role, he's not really playing, but you're not really playing the DH role. You're sitting on the bench while you're DHing. But the other person that could be in there is Jeremiah Jackson, just because I think it's pretty clear he is pretty shaky out in right field. There's not really room for him anywhere else. So the right field position is where Jeremiah Jackson would play, but I think most Oriole fans who've seen him out there are not really comfortable with him out there. It would be preferable in an ideal situation to find a way to get his bat into the lineup without sort of the defensive liability that he poses, at least so far, in the outfield. That is kind of the situation. With that said, Jeremiah Jackson can play right field. As I sort of mentioned before, the Orioles aren't pressed to win games. If he is a little bit of a defensive liability, you could sort of run him out there in right field most of the time, most all of the time, without having too many problems or without that creating too many problems. There's not somebody else who is going to have to sacrifice playing time because, or there will be, but not guys the Orioles are really concerned with uh, sacrificing playing time if it's Dylan Carlson or Greg Allen that somehow don't make their way into the outfield because of Jeremiah Jackson being out there. I don't think the Orioles are going to lose too much sleep over either of those things. So it could have implications for other people's playing time, but I think not really in a way that the Orioles are worried about or concerned with. So it's not really too much. It's not too concerning if Jeremiah Jackson is out there. He is really the only on this current roster, really the only competition other than Rutschman, as I mentioned, for the DH slot on a given night for the Orioles. So if Jackson was if the Orioles are comfortable just putting Jackson out in right field every day for the rest of the season, more or less. Obviously, there are going to be some exceptions to that. But if they're comfortable putting him out there every day in right field, then uh, and the Orioles don't want to DH Adley Rutschman, then the Orioles are in good shape, and Kobe Mayo or Ryan Mountcastle can just be the DH, and the other one can play first base. Kobe Mayo, I think, will end up being the first baseman more often. I'll talk about the reasons for that going in a little bit here. But yeah, that's kind of the situation. It would be smooth if those two guys were kind of out of the way, Rutschman and Jackson, and the Orioles could just think about Mountcastle and Mayo as possible contenders for the DH role. Where this is going to get more complicated is with what the Oriole fans are expecting to be the addition of Samuel Basallo. That is really going to change things a little bit here and try to figure out, okay, what are the Orioles going to do? Because yes, we're going to want Basallo to get some playing time as catcher, but the Orioles are not going to be putting him in the catcher's position every single day, even for a month straight, right? And they're not going to have, and even if they did that, they're not going to sit Adley on the bench. So they would want him to move to DH, right? At least a bit. So The real question is, what are the Orioles going to do when Basayo enters the picture? The other thing about Basayo is they're not going to want Basayo catching every single day. They are going to put Adley into the catcher's role, at least for a good amount, I would imagine. And what's going to happen as a result of that is they do want Basayo's bat in the lineup, not because of the production necessarily that he's going to get or obtain for the Orioles, but more because they want him to develop as a hitter. They want him to get probably more at bats, as long as they don't hit the 140 cap. They want him to get more at bats than they want him to get more than less at bats, and he is going to be a main priority. So he will DH, I would imagine, when he arrives finally. When he doesn't DH, he might go play some first base, right? So that's a little bit of the complication is you have sort of this mix of guys who are all uh too clustered at the critical positions, and it's going to be sort of difficult to navigate how each of these guys are going to get playing time. That's kind of the question here. So basically, if it comes down to it, Mayo, I think, is going to get the bulk for one. In an ideal situation where Mountcastle and Mayo can both be in the lineup, one being the first baseman and one being the DH for the rest of the year, it begs the question, okay, well, which one is going to do which, right? Mountcastle is definitely a better defender, but the Orioles want to see what Mayo can do at first base. They want to further assess him and they want him to develop and grow as a first baseman. Although the Orioles would be getting more defensive value for putting Mountcastle out there, they're not really gaining anything beyond that in terms of he's not going to improve significantly at the position by him being out there. So they're going to favor having Mayo be the first baseman while Mountcastle DHs so they can develop and assess his skills. So in that situation, Mayo will probably get, I think, the majority of the innings at first base when it's a competition between the two of them for who will hit and or who will DH and who will play first base. The question also sort of comes down to a little bit what is the value of playing Ryan Mountcastle right now? And I think that question doesn't have a great answer. I think potentially you want to demonstrate and prove that he's healthy. And that's about it, I think, for the Orioles and from the Orioles' perspective, because Ryan Mountcastle, I think that most of the league sort of knows who he is, right? I'm going to talk about, the potential for him being traded in a minute. And that's why I'm sort of bringing up this discussion. There's not a lot of value to playing Ryan Mountcastle other than the production and whatever positive additions he would contribute to the win column for the Orioles. I think the Orioles would want to prove that he's healthy to potentially keep him available as a trade chip in the off season if the right situation were to arrive or were to arise, I guess. If that were to be the situation, then I think it makes sense for the Orioles to want to get Mountcastle some playing time so that he can show and demonstrate to the rest of the league, look, if you trade for me, I'm available. I'm healthy. I've shown you a good solid month here where I was doing my normal Ryan Mountcastle things, and I'm available. And yeah, the Orioles, from their perspective, I think that's what they want Ryan Mountcastle to prove, to demonstrate. In terms of his actual production, beyond the demonstrating that he's healthy, his actual production, what he does these last 2 months will have very little impact on his trade value. barring something we're not expecting, or yeah, barring I don't know Vlad Guerrero type numbers going the rest of the way. And even if he did, it would still be very much a question how much that would increase his value. But barring some significant outlier in terms of his production going forward, what his production actually does the rest of the way, I think, is going to have little impact overall on his trade value. I think the rest of the league knows who Ryan Mountcastle is. He's been in the league for several years at this point. We know that Ryan Mountcastle can string a few good weeks of good baseball together, of good offense together. We know that he could get very, very hot for a short period of time. And the rest of the league knows that too. And if he were to get really, really hot at the end of this season, whatever team would be acquiring him wouldn't be acquiring him for a playoff push. They'd be acquiring him in the off season. And whatever momentum, whatever streakiness, or however hot he was at the plate would obviously not then translate to the beginning of next season. So, what he does offensively the rest of the way is not really going to, everything is going to be a fresh start, a clean slate next year on opening day next year. So, whatever Ryan Mountcastle does now is not really, I think, going to impact his trade value in the context of the league having several years to assess what kind of player he is. So, given that Mountcastle's value is not going to be impacted through whatever performance he creates, the young guys are going to get, I think, prioritized in terms of playing time. The young guys, Jeremiah Jackson, and Kobe Mayo, they both need their ability. They need their auditions. They need their moments. And this is really the perfect time to give both of them auditions to see what kind of players they can be at the major league level. If not now for the Orioles, when are they going to do this? So it wouldn't make a lot of sense, especially with Mountcastle sort of being who he is, there not being a lot there to show off to the rest of the league. This is Mountcastle, I think, will get the bench in favor of the other younger guys, Basayo included, when he arrives. Mountcastle will be sitting on the bench so that these other guys can grow, develop, get their auditions, and become better baseball players to help the Orioles moving forward. The Orioles can sort of then think about whatever inclusion Ryan Mountcastle will have. We could think about that and just starting him and revving him up next year in particular. Obviously, he's still going to practice. He is still going to hit on occasion. He's still going to get some reps, but overall, he's not going to, I don't think, get the bulk of the playing time because these other guys really do need it. And this is a really critical and important time to utilize for the Orioles to not waste that on somebody like Ryan Mountcastle, who we know what he is more or less at this point in his career. So that discussion about Ryan Mountcastle does sort of bring us to what are the Orioles going to do in 2026? What are the Orioles going to do moving forward? The Orioles will have Adley Rutschman, Basayo. They will have Kobe Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle. I think that it is more or less safe to assume that not really all of them can coexist in the current way that they are now without some changes. So what options sort of do the Orioles have going forward that are possibilities for how the Orioles can sort of navigate this kind of situation, right? So Of course, some of it would get resolved if, let's say, Kobe Mayo is not good enough to be a Major League Baseball player. I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying if that were to be the hypothetical and he were sort of more or less out of the equation, or the Orioles were to trade him or something like that, that would sort of make the decision a lot easier. I think the Orioles probably are trying to find ways to get Mayo. I think that the front office likes Kobe Mayo. So I don't think that the Orioles are giving up on him by any stretch. I don't think the Orioles have given up on him. And in any case, I mean, he is getting some playing time now. So, but if he were not, for instance, to be cut out for the majors, that would, of course, make the sort of resolve a lot of this, right? If one of these guys gets injured, that would also resolve or help to resolve a lot of it. Um, Although you still sort of have this problem when they're healthy, what that we still have Mayo and um, Mountcastle at first base, and that's sort of in of itself a little bit of a problem. So, what are the options for the Orioles? So, option number one is to either trade Kobe Mayo or Ryan Mountcastle in the offseason. If either of them is to go, I think it's likelier that Ryan Mountcastle go to were to be dealt. And I think that that would be the preferable sort of solution for the Orioles. Um, Ryan Mountcastle will be a free agent after the 2027 season. So if the Orioles were to trade him this offseason, another team would have a Ryan Mountcastle for 2 years. And that is pretty, could be potentially enticing to another team, especially if they have a hole at the first base position. He could be sort of a stopgap, maybe with some room to sort of yeah, maybe with the possibility of him being dealt now. Worst case scenario, they could probably deal him away at a later time. That team with still a year left on his contract or anything. So there's some flexibility. You're not committing to Ryan Mountcastle for the long term. He could be sort of a stopgap solution if you have a prospect in the minors, maybe in high A or something like that, that you're waiting to see maybe this guy could be a really, really good player, that kind of thing, or a college draft pick or something like that. Ryan Mountcastle could kind of be somebody that could sort of occupy first base for a period of time while you're sort of assessing and then potentially deal at a later point in time. Of course, if you have sort of a more flexible sort of roster, if you have another first baseman, but that first baseman can also play third, or you have a Ramon Urias type player that can play first base, or obviously your first baseman or your primary first baseman is probably going to be a different player than Urias. But in any case, if you have a guy at first base that could also play third or something like that, right? Or if you yeah, something along those lines, um, then you would be sort of a candidate team potentially who might be interested in Ryan Mountcastle. So the Orioles could potentially then use Mountcastle to get maybe a back end pitcher, something like that, or another position player. It's really kind of up in the air at this point what the Orioles are going to go for, prioritize, but potentially a back end of the rotation pitcher, something like that, or you know that and a prospect or something along those lines. Um, could be some possible returns, just brainstorming off the top of my head, for Ryan Mountcastle, but it would also do a lot for the Orioles to clear up and sort of be able to have a more flexible roster, which is sort of would potentially be a big motivating factor in trying to trade Mountcastle. That's why I was sort of having this discussion about trading him. because it presents a possibility for alleviating some of the pressure that is created by how this roster at the first base DH position, a lot of the stress and the strain and overload potentially being created at that position by the current arrangement. Now, if you end up trading Ryan Mountcastle, the potential worrisome part about that is Kobe Mayo doesn't work out, or Samuel Basayo, you have him catching, or he gets injured, or something like that. Then you're sort of in a situation where, well, maybe you'll have to figure some things out, or figure out how to work things going forward. Um, or if Basayo comes up, struggles, gets back sent back down to AAA. Hopefully that will not happen. Not expecting that to happen, but there are possibilities. And if you do trade Mountcastle, you are putting some faith and some trust and investment into both Basayo and Mayo. So trading Mayo would probably be in some ways a safer sort of route for the Orioles to go. But I think that the Orioles feel like there's a little too much upside there for them to do that. So I think that's probably not their intention. So that would be sort of one option, or one alternative, or one way for the Orioles to sort of address that kind of situation, or this situation, or this problem that I'm sort of describing. The other thing that the Orioles could do, and I'm thinking about this predominantly for next year. I'm really thinking about this for next year, is the Orioles could try adding Kobe Mayo to a particular position. Now, the other the other regular infield options are not really a possibility. He was tried over at third base. It seems like the Orioles did not want to move forward with that idea. They were really limiting his time over there, even when Westberg was on the IL. Um, Urias was getting the time over there in general, much more than Mayo was. Mayo had a couple things a couple starts or something over at third, but I think the Orioles did not really like that experiment, so that's when they ended up moving him to first. Um, so third base, while Jordan Westberg is healthy, is going to sort of create it's adding third base for Kobe Mayo is not really going to help to resolve this problem, because Westberg is going to be there, and then you would just be putting Westberg in the DH role if Mayo was playing third, and you would have the same exact dilemma that you're having now. Westberg is also probably a better hitter. I think it's more or less fair to say, than Mountcastle. He definitely seems to be on track to be at a bare minimum. So yeah, that third base is probably not the solution for thinking about Kobe Mayo. However, one of the sort of things when he was a young prospect, and it's sort of still talked about as a possibility for him, is moving him to an outfield position. Now, he's not going to go play center, but he does have a good arm, and right field is a possibility. So if I was going to say Ryan Mountcastle, if Kobe Mayo can add right field to his abilities, and if the Orioles are willing and comfortable putting him out in right field, that would do so much in terms of how the Orioles can try to figure out this solution. Because if he is then transferred to the outfield, right now, as you can see, the Orioles outfield is not looking great, to say the least. We are going to have Tyler O'Neill. Colton Cowser is going to be an outfield position. After that, it's really sort of up in the air what's going to happen with the outfield. Now, I would have thought that Cowser would have had more time in center field. He's injured now, but as soon as Mullins got dealt, I sort of thought he was going to take over as the center fielder. I think in part because of his bat. They have not wanted to do that. Um, and they've sort of, when he was playing, kept him in the corner. But if Kobe Mayo gets added to right field, there's Tyler O'Neill in left and Cowser in center. That could be a possible arrangement, or Mayo in left and O'Neill in right. There are different ways to sort of configure it. Or if O'Neill's hurt, there are other options. That would be one way to sort of address this sort of problem. If Mountcastle played first, you had Mayo in either left or right, probably right. That would open up a lot of sort of possibilities in terms of what the Orioles could do, how the Orioles could try to figure this out. And even if he does still play some first base or whatever, to even be able to have the option to put him in right field, I think would be a really, really big benefit to the Orioles. Now, whether he can do it, that's sort of another question. We know his arm is good. He has a good arm. I think the arm could transition to outfield rather easily. The question about the range, and those are sort of where the question marks come in. He also would have to get reps there. He would have to spend a lot of time in spring training working on the position in order to do it. But that would be one of the possible solutions for how the Orioles could try to solve this problem. Crisis, I think, is too extreme, but problem that the Orioles have at first base with these two uh, players who, as of right now, sort of are stuck at the first base position, are both right-handed and really sort of diminish and infringe on the roster being able to sort of be as flexible and as maneuverable as it can be. You want utility infielders. You definitely want two guys that can play the shortstop position, but you don't necessarily want two guys that only ever play first base. You would like, if you have one first baseman, and then you have another guy that can play first and third or something like that, or first and outfield, like Ryan O'Hearn did at times. Things like that, that can be sort of an arrangement that is more, that a team is more able to work with. But neither Mountcastle nor Mayo is going to really put up the offensive production, it seems at least, to justify having two right-handed hitters play only first base. So I do think that this is a problem that the Orioles need to be working on and need to be thinking about how to rectify and change going into 2026 to maximize the abilities of this roster, to not be stashing value and production on the bench. The Orioles need to find a way to figure this out so that the Orioles can have the best 2026 season that they can. And I think that somehow involves making some changes somehow, some way to the first base position for the Orioles. So, all right, we will end the episode there. Thank you all so much for listening. Please follow the show, give us a 5-star rating and review. We are on YouTube. Feel free to watch this video, like this video, comment with any thoughts that you might have. If you want to get in touch with the show, please email us, thewarehousepod@gmail.com. Please follow us on Blue Sky and on Instagram at thewarehousepod. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for listening. This has been the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse, and go O's.